The atmosphere inside the lavish ballroom of the New York charity gala buzzed with anticipation. This evening was meant to be an elegant affair, a gathering devoted to goodwill, drawing some of society's most high-profile figures. Under the brilliance of dazzling chandeliers, philanthropists and media elites mingled, sipping champagne and exchanging the latest news. Melania Trump, draped in an exquisite midnight blue gown, was the guest of honor. Despite the endless political controversies surrounding her husband, she had always carried herself with grace, choosing to focus on charitable work rather than the chaos. Tonight was no different. As she took the stage to speak on children's education and humanitarian efforts, the crowd hushed. She spoke with quiet confidence, her Slovenian accent lending elegance to her words. But just as she was finishing, a voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Mrs. Trump, how does it feel to be complicit in your husband's agenda?" The tone was sharp, dripping with mockery. Standing near the front was a tall, impeccably dressed journalist, David Calloway, a well-known political correspondent famous for his scathing critiques of conservatives. Holding his microphone like a weapon, he smirked slightly, fully aware of the tension he had just ignited. A heavy stillness fell over the room. Attendees shifted in their seats, glancing at one another. This was no ordinary Q&A. Melania parted her lips slightly, prepared to respond, but before she could, Calloway pressed forward. "Your husband has been accused of dividing the country, inciting hatred," he continued, his voice growing bolder now that every eye was on him. "And yet, here you stand, portraying yourself as a role model. Wouldn't you say that the real role models are the ones resisting him?" The weight of his words thickened the air. A few journalists smirked, sensing the potential for a viral moment. But before Melania could reply, another voice cut through the silence, strong, unwavering. "That's enough." Heads turned as Barron Trump stepped forward from the audience. No longer the quiet boy the world had once known, he was now 17, tall, composed, and clearly accustomed to public scrutiny. He wasn't just the former president's son anymore. He was his own person. And in this moment, he wasn't going to let anyone disrespect his mother. With squared shoulders and a clenched jaw, Barron strode past the tables, stepping onto the stage without hesitation. He positioned himself between his mother and the journalist, his presence alone shifting the energy in the room. Calloway arched an eyebrow, caught off guard, but keeping his composure. "Excuse me?" Barron didn't flinch. "You can ask tough questions," he said, his voice steady. "But this isn't journalism. It's harassment." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Calloway let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, and I suppose the president's son is about to lecture me on media ethics." Barron tilted his head slightly, his gaze locked onto Calloway's. "No," he said smoothly. "I'm going to show you what respect looks like." The tension in the room sharpened. Every eye was on Barron now. No one had expected him to step in like this, let alone with such calm confidence. Calloway, momentarily caught off balance, recovered quickly. "Respect," he repeated, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Forgive me, Barron, but I don't think you or your family are in any position to lecture the press on respect." A few uncertain chuckles scattered across the room. Some guests remained still, watching the confrontation unfold. But Barron stood his ground, shoulders squared. "You can ask whatever questions you want," he said. "But what you just did, that wasn't a question. You tried to embarrass my mother." Calloway's smirk flickered slightly, but he held his ground. Mrs. Trump is a public figure. She should expect tough questions. Barron took a step forward, forcing Calloway to look up at him. "Then why didn't you ask about her work tonight? About the children she's helping?" The room shifted. A simple question, but one that cut deep. Calloway had no real answer, and he knew it. His goal hadn't been to discuss Melania's contributions. It had been to turn her into a political target. Before Calloway could recover, Barron continued. "You didn't come here to report on this event," he said. "You came here to make headlines." Silence settled over the room. The crowd was no longer just observing, they were realizing something. Calloway glanced around as if searching for support, but none of the other journalists spoke. They weren't used to being challenged like this, especially not by a Trump. Melania, standing quietly behind her son, placed a gentle hand on his arm. She didn't say anything, but her expression spoke volumes: pride, resilience, and an unspoken message. I'm right here with you. Calloway, sensing he was losing control, tried to regain ground. Forcing a smirk, he crossed his arms. You're young, Barron, he said. You don't understand how this works. Barron didn't blink. I know exactly how this works. His voice was smooth, unwavering. I've watched people like you attack my family since I was a kid. The smirk vanished from Calloway's face. Barron stepped forward again, his words cutting with precision. I just never thought you'd be desperate enough to go after a woman who's done nothing but help others. A whisper spread through the crowd. Even some journalists, expecting another predictable media takedown, were momentarily stunned into silence. Then, another voice rang out. Barron's right. The room turned toward a man in a tailored suit, an older gentleman, possibly a donor. He locked eyes with Calloway. This is a charity event, not the place for petty political ambushes. More murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded. For the first time that night, Calloway looked uncertain. His grip on the microphone tightened. And Barron? He was far from finished. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. Barron wasn't lashing out. He wasn't losing his temper. He was dismantling Calloway piece by piece. Calloway's confidence wavered, but he forced out a chuckle. You know, Barron, he said, it's easy to defend your family when you've been raised in a tower of privilege. But out here in the real world, journalists like me ask the tough questions. Barron's lips curled slightly. Oh, you mean the real world where my mother is dedicating her time to charity while you're here trying to make a headline by humiliating her? Calloway's smirk disappeared completely. Barron turned toward the audience. How many people came tonight to support children, to talk about education and giving back? Hands went up. Heads nodded. Even those who weren't Trump supporters had come for the cause. And how many came here to watch him turn this into a spectacle about himself? Laughter broke out. The dynamic had shifted. Calloway had lost control. He tried to speak, but Barron cut in smoothly. You came here hoping to humiliate my mother, he said. Instead, you humiliated yourself. Applause erupted. Even those who didn't support the Trumps recognized what had just happened. Calloway clenched his jaw. He had walked into this room expecting to control the narrative. Instead, he had become the story. And Barron? He had just made it clear no one would ever underestimate him again.